first of all, Paulo, for organizing this conference. And I want to thank all of you for participating in this conference. So here's what I would like to do the next 15 minutes. I would like to organize my presentation around 3 questions. First, where are we now? The bottom line here will be that while the fiscal program in the last 3 years perhaps was not perfect, it worked reasonably well. So, second question of the presentation will address what's left to do. Here the bottom line is that about 2/3 of the fiscal adjustment is done, and about 1/3 of the adjustment is still to be done. Finally, there's the question, what could go wrong going ahead? I think this is an important question. So we all know that we will need growth, and I guess there will be a lot of debate in the coming 2 hours. What should happen with public wages? What should happen with pensions? What about public investment? What about taxes? So these are all important concerns. But the main concern I want to put forward under this third question is whether fiscal discipline will stick in the coming years, or whether we will go back to politics as usual. So let me start with a quick look at the situation at the beginning of the program. This chart gives you the medium-term fiscal plans since the adoption of the euro. And I think there are 3 things you can take from this chart. One is, since the adoption of the euro, the 3% fiscal deficit limit set by the Maastricht Treaty was never reached. Second point is the medium-term fiscal plans were never really implemented. And finally, by 2010, budget situation had deteriorated very much, and so it was a quite unfavorable starting point at the beginning of the program. Now let me take a quick look at the fiscal program and compare the plans under the fiscal program with the outcomes. I would like to touch on 3 issues here. Let me start with the fiscal balance, fiscal deficit, and this takes me to the issue of the speed of fiscal adjustment under the program. I think given the large fiscal deficit in 2010 and the relatively high level of public debt, all people would agree a large fiscal adjustment was needed, but people could reasonably disagree what is the right speed of fiscal adjustment. And to get the adjustment speed right, basically you have to look at pros and cons. The typical pros for having a relatively fast fiscal adjustment are that the country has relatively high fiscal deficit and public debt, that the credibility of the fiscal policy is relatively low, and that available financing is limited. And I guess all these considerations were probably in place at the beginning of the program. At the same time, there are other considerations that have to be taken into account that would counsel against a very fast fiscal adjustment. One is the issue of fiscal multipliers. So if you believe the fiscal multipliers are very high as you start the fiscal adjustment, there may be a reasonable argument to go slow. The other, the other issue is whether the labor market could experience so-called hysteresis effects, meaning by that the structural unemployment could get very entrenched under a very fast fiscal adjustment. And finally, there's the question whether the fiscal adjustment at a high speed can be done with a reasonable quality. Now, when we compare here plan with the outcome under the fiscal program, I think we see two things. First, the assumed speed of fiscal adjustment in 2011, the first year of the fiscal program, was probably too fast, and the adjustment didn't materialize. This is partly understandable because the program started in the middle of the year. When we look ahead, beyond 2011 to 2012, 13, and 14, we see that the program was adjusted. In practice, the fiscal deficit target was adjusted 2 times. And this was because the balance of pros and cons for the speed of fiscal adjustment had changed. Namely, we had lower growth, lower GDP growth. This was in part because of the external environment being worse. The euro area went into a recession in 2012. This was not anticipated under the program. But then also fiscal multipliers were probably a bit higher than what was assumed under the program. And finally, there was also better access to financing than was assumed under the program. So the program adjusted to these circumstances. Let me now move on to the next issue, and that is the composition of adjustment. If you do the numbers, you would see that the program assumed that about 2/3 of the fiscal adjustment would come from expenditures, and 1/3 would come from the revenue side. When we look at the deviations of outcomes from the plans, we see that on the revenue side, when we look at percent of GDP, the program pretty much played out as was expected under the original program projections. Now, this does not mean that the composition of revenues was exactly as the program anticipated. Indirect tax collections were lower than program. Social contributions were also lower than program. And these lower revenues were made up by higher personal income taxes. Now on the expenditure side, this is where we see a bigger deviation from the program plans. Namely, that outcomes in terms of the expenditure GDP ratio were higher than was anticipated under the program. But again, if we look at this more closely, taking into account that nominal GDP growth was lower under the program than anticipated, we would see that in terms of absolute amounts, meaning in billions of euros, the adjustment on the expenditure side was about what was programmed. We see it only a deviation when we express expenditures as a percent of GDP. Finally, public debt. Here we had clearly significant deviations between what was in the program and what the latest data show us. Now, the deviation in public debt is basically due to 2 reasons. The first is nominal GDP growth was lower. This explains about half of the deviation of the public debt from what was programmed. And the second reason is we had a different deficit path. So we had higher deficits and that added to public debt. Now, let me move on to the next issue. What is now left to do? So let me go back to the previous chart on medium-term fiscal plans. Here you see the medium-term fiscal strategy for 2014-18, starting in 2014. So, as in the past, and this may not be too reassuring, we see a plan taking us back to the medium-term goal of having a balanced budget by 2018. But when we look overall at the situation, we see that we have done about 2/3 of the fiscal adjustment over the last 3 years, and what's left is roughly 1/3. And we should keep into account that fiscal policy will have a little bit of a tailwind during the next few years, because the output gap is going to close over those next few years. Now, in terms of the adjustment strategy, as was explained before, this medium-term fiscal strategy in terms of composition puts the emphasis on expenditure adjustment almost completely. And I assume that the details of the fiscal adjustment strategy will be the topic of the panel and the discussions that are going to follow. And so I will skip on to my next topic. Another thing that is left to do is not just fiscal adjustment, but also to continue building more effective fiscal institutions. By fiscal institutions, I mean budgetary management procedures, but I also mean improving tax administration, improving the management of state-owned enterprises, and so on. Here are a few of the items on the reform agenda for improving budgetary management. So on the fiscal data side, clearly we need more reliable fiscal information to know where we are in the fiscal adjustment. On the budgeting side, there is a strong case to streamline the appropriation structure of the budget. At this point, we have 4,400 lines, appropriation lines in the budget, which I think is probably must be one of the highest among OECD countries. There's still much to be done on accountability and spending controls. So spending ministries could be made more accountable for meeting the expenditure targets of the budget. And there's the issues with enforcing the commitment control law. And finally, fiscal risks. There is room for improving the analysis of fiscal risks. Now, let me turn to my final question. So what could go wrong? So when I talk to people here in Portugal, one observation I always hear is the big risk in the future is really politics. That fiscal discipline is not going to stick, and we go back to the politics as usual of the past. Now, one way to think about that issue, I'm trying to lay out in this chart here, you could think about this as being the choice between two equilibria. So you have a bad equilibrium where fiscal discipline is low, but because there's not much disciplining through the financial markets, you can maintain that equilibrium for a relatively long time. However, at some point, this equilibrium will lead to a financial crisis, just as we experienced in 2011. Financial crisis takes you a program. A program by definition imposes fiscal discipline. And the question now is, are we going back to the old equilibrium with low fiscal discipline? Or can we move on to a good equilibrium, where we have high fiscal discipline and the promise of having a stable equilibrium, meaning we are not going in circles between accumulating deficits and debt, then financial crisis program, back to the bad equilibrium. Now, on this topic, here are a few recipes that might be worthwhile to look at to lower the risks to fiscal discipline. The way I set it up here is, think about the budget process as consisting of 4 stages. Basically, the budget process goes through 4 stages. You have a kind of political stage where political parties put forward their plans, what they want to do with their fiscal policy. Then we have a formulation stage at the government level, where the budget is basically agreed between Ministry of Finance, the spending ministries within the government. Then we have a legalization stage, meaning this is where Parliament and maybe the Constitutional Court comes in. And then finally we have the implementation stage of the budget. There's the 4th stage. Now, all countries are struggling with biases in their spending, in their deficits. Now, different countries have found different recipes to impose more discipline on this process. So here is a list of what I would call out-of-the-box recipes that are worth looking at. One is the so-called Dutch recipe. Under the Dutch recipe, political parties are required to submit their fiscal plans before a political election, and there is an independent agency that looks at these fiscal plans and pronounces on whether it thinks these fiscal plans are realistic and consistent. This seems to work for the Dutch very well. At the formulation stage of the budget, there is what I would call the German-Austrian recipe. This is, you put in place a very strong Ministry of Finance that can stand up to the spending ministries and has a very strong position within the government in the budget formulation process. Another recipe would be using constitutional anchors, which implies anchoring specific fiscal targets in the Constitution. Finally, at the implementation stage, there is a so-called Brazilian recipe, basically putting in place a fiscal responsibility law that threatens fiscal policymakers that deviate from the plans with serious sanctions. Let me sum up. So, first of all, I think there are 2 very misleading caricatures around on what happened as regards fiscal adjustment. One you could call mission accomplished, where people say we are done, fiscal house, public finances are in order. The other caricature is this didn't really work. Now, I think both of these caricatures are pretty wrong. First of all, on mission accomplished, it was impossible to fix in 3 years fiscal problems that have been around for a long, long time. At the same time, a lot of fiscal adjustment has been done. A lot has been done on building more effective fiscal institutions, but that process has to continue over the next few years. And I would say that the medium-term fiscal strategy that is on the table is a good basis for doing that. Although, obviously, one can discuss the details. Now, still, I think the big question will be, quite apart from numbers and papers on medium-term fiscal plans, The big question will be where the fiscal discipline, the overall fiscal discipline is going to stick in the coming years.